Hi guys, welcome to AP World History Modern. If you don't know me, I'm Miss Sinclair, and this is our first lecture. So we are beginning our content with our earliest river valley civilizations. So we are currently going to be in Unit 0. Unit 0 is our unit on the foundations. This is going to be the stuff that's not actually on the AP test anymore, but it's still important. I don't really feel like I can call myself a good world history teacher if you never learn about Mesopotamia or Egypt or Rome. So we're not going to spend a ton of time on it, but we are going to do a little bit of learning, not only content, but this is a really good way for you to learn how to be a good history student. Consider it your training wheels. So we're starting with Mesopotamia. So when you're doing your notes here and remotely, so to speak, you're going to be completing a daily cover page. So your daily cover page is going to be something you will find on our Teams page, and then you will submit it through Turnitin. You are not required to turn them in the same day. They will be due usually at the end of the week. You'll have a few days to complete these lectures and the daily cover page. They're not complex, but it's a way to make sure you are actively engaged. Similarly, you are watching these on Edpuzzle. So that means there are questions throughout the lecture. These are things that we'd normally do in class. They're practice multiple choice questions. They are discussion questions. And since we have to do this remotely, it means that those discussions have to happen remotely as well. So you'll be responding to those things on your own. But I do want you to complete your bell work. You will find that there is a bell work spot on your daily cover page. So feel free to pause the video at any point if you need to get a piece of paper or I'm moving too quickly. This is one of the benefits of this sort of remote teaching, is that you can pace yourself. So with that in mind, as we start thinking about history, I want you to consider, what is your earliest memory? What's the first thing that you remember? Sorry. It's kind of tricky because, of course, we have memories that we're not sure if they're really ours. Sure, I remember, making cookies with my grandma. But do I, or did I just hear the story or see the pictures of 3-year-old me making cookies? One of the things I can remember and know for sure that this is my memory is we were living in Indiana, and I was probably in kindergarten at the time. I remember in our backyard there was a toad that lived in the woodpile. There are other stories that are sort of false memories, but I want you to think, what's the first thing that you remember that you're sure is your own memory? So, some of these announcements are not relevant for us because we're not in an actual classroom. Hazard when you reuse PowerPoints from year to year. However, I do want you to pay attention to our notes today. We're learning about Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus River Valley. So that means our objective is that you will be able to compare Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, and the Indus River Valley civilization in writing. So for your first discussion question, and you'll be answering this on Edpuzzle, how would you define civilization? And what would you consider the characteristics of a civilization? We use the word civilization all the time, but what does it actually mean? What is a civilization? A side note, your daily cover page is not your notes. I do recommend that you take notes. I recommend that you handwrite your notes. I know that with everything being on computers, it seems like it'd be way easier just to type your notes. And we're not going to be turning these in, so it's up to you. However, studies have shown that handwriting out information makes it stick in your head better. And especially since everything else we are going to be doing is going to be digital, I think it's important that there is some part of your learning experience is handwritten. So I would recommend that you handwrite your notes. Okay, so how would you define civilization? Well, in general, historians and sociologists and anthropologists define civilization as a complex society, right? This is a very simple definition of it. It's generally an ambiguous term, often used to denote more complex societies, but sometimes used by anthropologists to describe any group of people sharing a set of cultural traits. So, what do civilizations have in common? Well, civilizations have certain political, social, economic, and technological traits that we would expect to see. So, in the beginning, we were hunter-gatherers, right? Humans were nomadic, traveling from place to place, following different crops, following different animals, and we didn't settle. In a huge, probably one of the most important events in human history, the agricultural revolution, we began to settle in one place. We realized that, hey, corn grows here every year. This wheat keeps on going here. And if we leave seeds here, when we come back the following year, there's more wheat. And we realized we can stay in one place and cultivate crops. So instead of having to travel, we can be sedentary. And the agricultural revolution, that's what starts human civilization. So what do we expect to see? We see the birth of cities. So cities serve as administrative centers. We see political systems based on the control of a defined territory as opposed to kinship connections, meaning my family controls this area generally. Wherever you find a Sinclair, it's our land. We control the land to this river and to those mountains. We find that people are engaged in specialized, non-food producing activities. In the past, when everyone was working to gather food, you didn't have specific people whose jobs it is to make music, to be scribes, to be warriors or potters. Now you do. We find social distinctions based off wealth, based off skin color, so you have social hierarchies developing. We see the emergence of monument building, a system for keeping permanent records, whether it's going to be cuneiform, hieroglyphics, the knots that the Incas are going to use. We see the birth of long-distance trade and major advances in arts and sciences. So, we see that our first major civilization is going to be Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, which roughly translates to the land between rivers, is going to be in what we call the Fertile Crescent. It's going to be smack dab between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So think modern-day Iraq, modern-day Kuwait, right in there. So we'll see all of our earliest civilizations are settling in these river valleys. That's because when you are relying on just rain for your crops, you want to try and figure out a better way to get water. Well, rivers, and rivers flood. So we see that our earliest groups of people are settling here. Here's the thing. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flood very unpredictably. They are going to have these hugely destructive floods, and you never really know when they're going to happen. Keep that in mind. That's an important aspect of Mesopotamian culture. We see that there are many people groups in this area: Sumerians, Assyrians, Akkadians, Babylonians. We see that they are going to dominate this area, so like the Sumerians, are really going to dominate southern Mesopotamia through the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, so about 3000 BCE. BCE stands for before the Common Era. So as we move towards year 0, we're counting down. So if you are a Sumerian in the year 3000 BCE, your future in 1,000 years would be 2000 BCE. Semitic peoples are another ethnic group. It also includes languages, so this should sound familiar to you if you took human geography. So Hebrew, Aramaic, Phoenician, Arabic, these are all Semitic languages, and they emerge from this area. So, sorry guys, trying to figure out the best place. Sorry, looks like my little visual bubble might be covering things up sometimes. Where was I? City-states. We see that our Mesopotamian society is based around these city-states. So a city-state is a small, independent state consisting of an urban center and the surrounding agricultural territory. So, what does that mean? It means you have a city, and then the land around it, the farmland around it, is attached to that city. So the warriors and the king who lives in that city, they get their food from the farmland, but then it's their job to protect those farmers. So Mesopotamia isn't a single unified empire as we think of it nowadays, right? It would be as if Phoenix was its own independent state, country, and Los Angeles was its own independent country, and so was Tucson, and so was Las Vegas. And sure, these cities controlled the land around it, but also these cities were constantly going to war with each other. So Mesopotamia was very violent, and these city-states were constantly fighting back and forth. So Babylon is the largest and most important Mesopotamian city-state. So it's going to be in existence between 1830 to about 1500 BCE, then destroyed by the Assyrians, rebuilt around 650 to 500 BCE. And of the various rulers of Babylon, the most important is Hammurabi. Hammurabi is important primarily for his legal code that he keeps. This is our first cohesive legal system. It was inscribed on black pillars and put throughout the kingdom. And it's not a legal code like we think of today. You know, it's not going to be in section 1, subsection B, it is against the law to cross the road anywhere but a crosswalk. Instead, this is a bunch of examples. If a slave steals your goat, this is the punishment for it. However, if your neighbor of a similar social standing steals your goat, this is the punishment. If a girl steals your goat, here's the punishment. So we see that there are 282 laws, and these laws are very specific based off your social status and the gender of the offender. So if you're a slave, your punishment would be very different than if you're like a priest. If you're a woman, your punishment's going to be different than if you're a man. We could look at these laws now, and we might be horrified. They seem so brutal for small crimes. If someone steals your goat and returns it, your hand gets cut off. What? He brought the goat back. What's the big deal? But the idea was supposed to be for the punishments to fit the crime. If you get in a fight with someone and you lose your eye, you have the right to take out their eye, right? It's equal. If someone steals your goat, you have the right to steal one of their goats. From a historical point of view, This source reveals a lot about the social hierarchies within Mesopotamia. It is our first evidence of government having real control over the behavior of people. We see evidence of property rights, right? It's your goat. The goat is your property. So we see that legal codes from early civilizations reflected and reinforced existing social and political hierarchies. So let's talk about Mesopotamian society in general. We see at the center of every Mesopotamian city-state is going to be a ziggurat. You can see it pictured there on the screen. It's a large pyramid-like structure. It's the temple. So in Mesopotamian religion, there were a separate god for every city-state. And the gods were anthropomorphic. That means they were like humans. They had the same needs as humans. They had the same drive. So they got hungry. They got sleepy. They got annoyed. Right? In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods decide to release an epic flood to destroy humanity because they were annoyed with how loud humans were being. So, Mesopotamians are very wary of the gods. Everything they're doing is to appease the gods. Remember, the natural environment in which they live in is potentially violent, these floods, and unpredictable, just like the gods, right? How they understand their natural environment is the same as how they understand their gods. So if the natural environment is violent and unpredictable, well, their gods must be as well. So if your city-state is, let's say, Babylon, and you're winning all your battles against like Sargon and Akkad and all of your neighboring city-states, that means your god is happy. That means your god's the best. So one of the ways that kings like Hammurabi were able to demonstrate their rule was through this idea of sort of divine right. The gods picked me to be king over all of you. And the way you can tell is because I'm winning. So I'm kind of the best. In these ziggurats, thousands of priests lived, and it was a hereditary office passed from father to son. So Mesopotamia's polytheistic. Every city-state had their own gods and goddesses, and your everyday person would wear amulets, say spells, leave offerings. Mesopotamian society in general is going to reflect three main social classes. First, at the top of our hierarchy, you have the free land-owning class, high-ranking officials, warriors, priests. These are going to be people who are wealthy, who are not beholden to anyone else. Then, next level down, you have dependent farmers and artisans. So these are people who maybe work the land owned by this warrior or work for this merchant. They are going to make up the primary rural workforce. Third level down, slaves. So we're going to see slaves are really common in the ancient world. But when you think of ancient slavery, do not think of the chattel slavery of like the American South, right? This is going to be more, I don't want to say benign, but one of the distinctive features of chattel slavery in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries is the fact that the black slaves were viewed as subhuman. Slaves were not. Slaves in this era were just like that was just your lot in life. Probably what happened was your city got conquered and you were taken as a captive and sold into slavery. And so as a slave, you worked probably as a cook, as a maid, right? You weren't really that different from a dependent farmer, apart from the fact that you weren't free. So one of the things we also see in this time period is that food surplus is increasing, which will lead to an increase in the total fertility rate. So as women are able to get pregnant, stay pregnant, and their children are able to survive, we see that family sizes increase. With that means women's roles change. So in the past, when you had fewer children and your nutrition wasn't so good, so you weren't getting pregnant that often in general, women played a much more active role outside of the home. But if you're constantly pregnant and you're breastfeeding and you got a toddler you have to look after and like a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, like your main occupation is going to be your children. So yes, there's definitely some like patriarchy in place here, but some of it's just practical. Like if you're breastfeeding, you got to have your baby with you. So with the food surplus and the increase in family size, we see a shift in women's role to being more child-oriented. And yet in Mesopotamia, women could still own property. They could still control their own wealth. They could engage in trade. It's just unlikely. So let's talk about technology. The main two things for Mesopotamia in terms of technology are going to be cuneiform, which is a system of writing. It's when you take a reed and you cut off the edge so it's at an angle. I don't know if you can picture it, but imagine you have a straw and you cut it at an angle so you sort of have like an oval shape, right? Same thing, except it's a reed, so it's hard. And then you stick that reed into clay, wet clay, and the symbols that you use make words or syllables. It's going to be used by Sumerians, Akkadians, Mesopotamians. Very few people are literate, like very, very few. And so you have a sort of social class, a specific role of scribes. We do have documents left over from this era, and they describe primarily economic things, like their lists of so-and-so sold us 50 tons of wheat, and we paid him blah, 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 blah. But we see contracts, we see some texts about political things, some literary texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's not a language, it's a system of writing. In the same way that the Roman alphabet that we use isn't a language, just a system of writing. All right, the other big invention is going to be bronze. So bronze is going to be an alloy, so a mix of copper and tin. Why would you do this? Well, copper is the easiest to work with because it's so soft. But the problem is it's so soft, so you can't really use copper as a plow because it will bend when it hits a rock instead of moving the rock out of the way. So mixing copper with bronze means that you have a much stronger metal that you can then use for weapons, tools, all kinds of stuff. So you might also hear this time period referred to as the Bronze Age. We also have irrigation. So you have these rivers, they flood. How do we get water from the rivers to our fields when they're not flooding? Well, you create irrigation. The last thing about technology and science, Mesopotamians were the best of like our early civilizations when it came to like math and science. They understood the concept of zero. It was pretty crazy, the things that they knew. All right. So next discussion question that you're going to answer for me. What does writing help civilizations accomplish? Like, why do we need writing? What does writing do? What does it change? So remember, you can always pause these videos to answer these questions, but I'm going to be moving on. This is a very silly video. You can find links to all the videos on our class YouTube page. There is going to be just whole playlists with all the videos that I show and that I don't show. It's silly. It's fun. I recommend it. All right, another discussion question. Using specific examples, explain how Mesopotamia developed in a challenging environment, and then describe Mesopotamian society and its technological advances. So one of the goals of these discussion questions is to really make sure you are learning the content, because it's so easy for it to go in one ear and out the other, or through your eyes and out your pencil, but it never sticks in your head. So I just went over all this information. The question is now, could you pause this video and without looking at your notes, answer these? If the answer is no, then you haven't learned it. You've just been introduced to it, which is why we study and we review our notes and we read the textbook, because we need to be exposed to information multiple times for it to really sink into our heads. It's another great video. Crash course, Mesopotamia. Optional if you want to watch.